Today on the Unabated podcast, Ed Feng from thepowerrank.com joins us to talk, of course, about power rating NFL teams, as well as some other angles that he's started to break into. It's a great show. Let's get to it.
If the guy goes unabated, that's the new word, unabated. That's too big a word. That's like mayonnaise. I'm assuming that's the biggest word I know.
Hello, everyone, and welcome on into the Unabated podcast. I'm Thomas Viola, and joining me, as always, Mr. Unabated himself, Captain Jack Andrews. Jack, we are really in full swing now when it comes to the sports calendar. You've got the pick of the litter when it comes to what sports you want to bet on and what to choose from here. College basketball started. Everything is going on at this point. What have you been betting? How have you been doing?
Yeah, Tom, we're at that point of the year where if you don't really care for one sport and have to bet on it, you don't have to. There's so many other options out there. It's a far cry from middle of summer when we're all lamenting that it's just baseball and WNBA out there. So, how am I doing? I'm doing good. This is a really fun time to be a sports bettor, especially if you can identify one or two angles in each of your sports. Your day is never empty. You always have something to be pursuing in terms of your betting.
And I mean, yeah, you're right. There's so many different angles to choose from, so many different options on the table here. College basketball, of course, has just started. I came so close to having an incredibly improbable cover on Syracuse 6.5 versus Colgate the other day. They came back from down 24, and there was a 3 at the end that sunk my cover. But I was sitting there like, I don't deserve to win this bet, so I wasn't too grumpy about it. But when it comes to the college basketball slate, is it time to top down bet it, or is this market just not efficient enough yet?
Yeah, one thing I am fond of saying is that all markets tend towards efficiency, and that doesn't mean just a game market. That also means all season long market. So right now, the college basketball market is very inefficient. We don't know what we don't know about a lot of these teams. We can go by what the coaches said in the preseason. We can go by what the pundits have said about this team. But when it comes down to it, there are something like 366 college basketball teams, and there was over 1,800 players in the transfer portal this year for college basketball. It's just almost randomness at this point. So it's tough to read into patterns this early in the season. And people need to realize that, especially if they're a top-down bettor. The sources of truth don't necessarily know all that much more. They're backed by these sharp bettors who are finding value and things like that. But honestly, it's just not a well-formed enough opinion of what college basketball should be at this point. It doesn't mean you can't find value betting top down. It just means you have to bet a little less and you have to look for higher edges and go about it that way.
Interesting. Yeah, you're not able to quite hit the sides and totals markets just yet. It's going to take some patience. It's going to take some time. When do you think the college basketball season will be really getting to that efficiency point?
I tell people conference play. That seems to be the line of demarcation. Right now, it's very interesting. We start the season with cupcake games. That's when you see these teams of a college you've never even heard of. They're up on the screen. And now we're getting into around the Thanksgiving time, we get into the pre-season, early season tournaments, the Race to Atlantis and all those tournaments, where it's neutral site places, or it's a site location where maybe one of the teams is hosting it, but for the most part, everybody else is playing neutral site games. And you gotta factor there are a lot of varying points of motivation for playing in these tournaments. Some coaches take a lot of stock in them to figure out who they are and what they are. Some coaches just take it as a little bit of a travel experience and bonding for their team. We're way early in the season. These games don't really matter all that much in the long run. But when you get to conference play, that's when it really starts to be, okay, these games matter, and we know who the teams are and what they're about by that time.
Now, shifting focus here to today's show, we have a fantastic guest for everybody, Ed Feng from the Power Rank. He's going to be talking about, of course, power ratings, how they work, how you can apply them to sports other than the NFL. But that's not all we're going to be talking about. He's got some other interesting projects in the works here, some other stuff that he's been looking at, some other edges that he's been grinding. We're going to talk to him about all that and more. I think we should get right to it, Jack.
Yeah, let's do it.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome on into the program from the Power Rank, Ed Feng, the Power Ranker himself. Ed, thank you so much for being with us here today.
Tom, thanks so much for having me on. It's an honor.
Now, of course, your backstory, your history here, you have to answer a question for me. Stanford PhD in chemical engineering, much different than Captain Jack's PhD in pimping from the School of Hard Knocks. How does one go from that to ranking sports teams? How did this connection get made? How did you go about that? And do you apply anything from your PhD studies into power ranking?
It's a great question. I certainly never expected to be in the sports betting world. I got my PhD, went on and did a postdoc, and was pretty determined to make my way in the academic world. And then I got to Berkeley and really didn't get along with the guy who was supposed to be my mentor. And among other things, told him that his research sucked, which was not the right thing to say to someone who has a lot of control over your future life. And so my academic career took a shockingly slow decline, but it was kind of over at that point. I was looking to transition to something else. I've always been a sports fan. And what I did in my research is, I have a PhD in chemical engineering, but I really studied something called statistical physics. And my approach to that was really an applied mathematics perspective. And what I studied a lot, particularly in my PhD, is random processes. So the math behind random processes, Markov chains. And that was a really good background to get into sports. Because of that background, I was able to look at some of the stuff that Google was doing with how they were organizing the web and their PageRank algorithm. And I said, hey, that's pretty cool. Let's try to apply this to sports. I got some NFL data and the first iteration, and what I still kind of post as team rankings on my site, is taking margin of victory and adjusting for strength of schedule. So I got some NFL data, I sent an email to my friends, and people gave me a lot of positive feedback. They're like, hey, this is pretty cool. So then I slowly started getting into college football and then college basketball. And it's still, I mean, there's two things I love, and that's sports and that's numbers. And I feel privileged to be able to do that. I feel privileged to make a contribution into the betting world. I have found that the things that I've developed actually probably 12, 13 years ago now are still pretty useful, and I'm still finding applications that are worthwhile and applying to some of the most difficult markets like NFL sides. That's the short story about how I went from kind of the academic world to sports betting.
You know, it's interesting, Ed, because one of the first things that a new bettor, when they come into sports betting, wants to know is, well, how do they make the line? How does Vegas know? How do they make that line?
Right.
And for a lot of sports, especially the NFL, football sports, it's power ratings, and basically just kind of figuring out the process of creating a power rating. And that then dictates that opening line that they make, and then the betting market hammers it into shape.
Yep.
So I've always found it fascinating about power ratings. I've tried to make my own power ratings many times. I tend not to go that route with my betting anymore. It seems like a lot of work for me. But I want to get your thoughts on your progress as creating the power rank and creating these ratings over the years. How has your process improved, and how does it matter in what you do in terms of your own betting?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, how is it useful? I mean, it's evolved a lot. I told you about that first iteration where I was just taking margin of victory, adjusting for strength of schedule, and that is very basic, and you won't get anywhere betting that right now. As things evolved over the last decade, the core of it is that I have an algorithm that adjusts for who you've played. And so this is important, particularly in college football. If you play in the SEC, you're playing a much more difficult schedule than if you play in the Sun Belt. And so it's a pretty mathematically rigorous way of saying, okay, well, you have these statistics. against an SEC schedule. How does that compare to a team that doesn't have the same strength of schedule? So I still find that particularly useful. I still cite those numbers a lot. The other thing that has evolved is that I don't just use margin of victory. We found that success rate is a really important metric in football. You know, how often on a play-by-play basis does an offense have success? So I take that quantity and I adjust for strength of schedule. I still use quantities like yards per play, adjust those for strength of schedule. So at the end of the day, I still find those things useful. Just for example, in the NFL over the last 3 seasons, if you just looked at how my model differed from the closing spread when my model prediction differed from the closing market by a point or more, it's winning about 53% of the time. I certainly don't recommend you just look at that and go blindly bet it, but I think that means that it's a useful tool. It's a useful tool to sort through a set of games, look at things this weekend and say, hey, you know, my number is like Kansas City -2.5 over Philadelphia. Let's look into that more. So I do still find that useful. And then I would just say, like, the other thing that, I guess there's the power rating aspect, right? There's also like the math aspect, the math of like adjusting for who you played. And I keep expanding that. And so, for instance, one thing I did over this offseason was not just to look at a team in terms of a football team in terms of offense, but like, let's separate who the quarterback is. We know the quarterback matters, right? And that was actually a lot more work than I thought it was. I actually had to go back and dig through some really old code, and it wasn't as easy as I thought, but it's useful because now, you know, I have a sense of what happens when you replace a Josh Dobbs with a Clayton Tune or whatnot. I think that also has applications elsewhere. Like, one thing I'm actually kind of interested in is baseball. There's been a ton of analytics in baseball, but but I haven't seen many like batter pitcher adjustments for who you've faced, right? So how does the strikeout rate, you know, maybe a pitcher has a great strikeout rate because they happen to play in a division where those batters strike out a lot. Can we adjust for that? Can we get insights into that? My guess is that that's going to help with the strikeout prop market. I dabbled a little bit in it last summer, and I didn't find it to be very strong. Could have been some small sample size, but I think that's an example of where, you know, it's not necessarily the idea of power rankings, but it is the idea of adjusting for who you played that I'm still finding to have a lot of betting implications.
Well, this is the right season for factoring in quarterback play. This has been such a high variance quarterback season, to say the least. Okay, so you mentioned a little bit about baseball there. What other sports do you use power rankings for? I remember I heard an interview with you one time. You talked about getting into tennis. Did you ever pursue that?
Yeah, no, I didn't. I do international soccer. So I take goals and adjust for who you played. Interestingly, that is actually the most visited page on my site. It ended up getting some SEO juice, and so a lot of people come to that. It's interesting. Like, I actually haven't been good about updating. So my site was the power rank, and I kind of started with rankings, and that's still a good core. You know, publishing rankings is not my main business motive. Like, my main business motive is getting value for my customers. And so sometimes things don't get updated as much. So to answer your question, like, I certainly do calculate numbers. I have, you know, for example, I do club soccer rankings based on expected goals or XG. And then I'm able to use my algorithm to adjust for that. But I think that's a good example. Like, I've actually never published those rankings on my site because, I mean, I just haven't had the time, but I do use them sometimes. I do use them to say, oh, well, you know, does this agree with the markets? Can we get some insights? And, you know, it's a tool. Like, I kind of follow the sport. I know Tom does as well. You know, what does that say about compared to the markets? And, you know, I guess my contribution there is that I'm able to make those strength of schedule adjustments. I'm able to use like Champions League and Europa League to see how good England is compared to Spain and Germany, et cetera.
And that actually brings up a good question that I wanted to ask you, because, yeah, I was looking on your site and I was very interested in especially your international soccer rankings. How much more difficult is that than trying to power rank something like the NFL, where at the very least, everyone's relatively on the same playing field. Like yes, the Jets are absolutely, it's wild that they play the same sport as the Chiefs, but they're both professional football teams. Whereas when it comes to international soccer,
Right.
when you break out of Europe, ranking Spain, Italy, and Germany and England, that's one thing. But then quantifying a team like the United States that is both playing some European teams, Mexico, and then also Trinidad and Tobago and Curacao, or like the
Right.
African qualifiers that are going on right now for the World Cup. Like you got Nigeria drawing Lesotho today. How do you how do you rank it? How much harder is it to compare strength of schedule with these teams that A, aren't all playing each other, and B, are playing widely different skill sets?
Once you have the data, it's all the same. You let the math do the work and it spits out an answer. And then you get to decide whether that makes any sense based on your knowledge. Getting the data can be a different issue. It's so beautifully easy to get NFL data these days. Like the play-by-play is all there. It's such a clean format and you can do so many things with it. And I've been able to do a lot about that. Scraping world soccer scores is not fun. So that's kind of where the difficulties and the differences are between the two things that you just talked about. But once you have the data, you stick it in a black box and it comes out and it's all the same.
It essentially it's adjusting for even the fact that like creating three expected goal Morocco creating three expected goals throughout an Africa like AFCON tournament. It adjusts for that compared to England creating three expected goals throughout a UEFA Euros.
Yes.
Interesting.
Yeah, the math just does it.
So I know this year, Ed, you've been focusing a little bit more on props. Has that been kind of a paradigm shift for you? Do you have to think about it differently, or are you using some of those same general principles and now applying it to props?
Yeah, I would say that it is very different. And the math is much simpler. I started doing interception props this year. I've actually had this research about how to predict interceptions since 2020. So it's a little silly on my part that I've waited a couple seasons to actually start applying it to props. But the basic idea is that interception rate is not very predictive of future interception rate. It's interceptions are rare, and when you look at a quarterback's interception rate, it doesn't really say much. What you can do is instead of just looking at interceptions, you can look at all the times that a quarterback puts a ball in a dangerous spot. So obviously, if the ball gets picked off, that's putting the ball in a dangerous position. The NFL play-by-play actually tracks passes defended, so all plays in which a defender gets a hand on the ball. So you can actually track something called bad ball rate. And this is the rate of pass attempts that a defender gets his hand on. The NFL average is about 11.7. And based on an NFL quarterback's bad ball rate, I'm able to back out what his interception rate should be and then predict how many interceptions that he should throw in a game. And it's been working pretty well this season. I've been really happy with it. But to your question, Jack, the math is really simple. It's a matter, there's no schedule adjustments or anything. I suppose I could do them, but my initial research said that defenses really had little predictability about bad balls. It looked pretty random across most NFL defenses. So right now, my assumption is that the quarterback fully controls whether the ball is put into a dangerous position. So just for an example, like Joe Burrow seems pretty good at not throwing picks, but he's pretty much league average in terms of bad ball rate. He's basically exactly at that 11.6 over about the last 3 years. And he's always projected to throw 38 or 39 passes, which is certainly at the high end of the NFL. So the model says bet over a half interception on Joe Burrow. It's obviously been up and down this year, but in general, that's been a pretty good bet.
I'm sorry, Jack, but I'm surprised to hear that it's mostly in the quarterback's hands. You would expect there to be a correlation between defensive pass rush ability and interceptions, wouldn't you?
Yeah, you certainly would. There was some other work I did that kind of looked at defensive pressure faced and interceptions. I didn't find much of a relationship. Sacks are more of a quarterback statistic than we usually tend to give them credit for.
Mm-hmm.
the offensive line certainly matters. The opposing pass rush certainly matters, but quarterbacks are probably the biggest factor. Actually, I probably shouldn't say that, but they have a more of a factor than most people think of. And then just kind of from an anecdotal kind of small sample perspective this year, like you can see the markets don't expect Arizona and Chicago to pick off an opposing quarterback. You can see the market change on the opposing quarterback, whoever's playing those teams. Mm-hmm. And I think I'm like 1-4 against one of those teams and 4-1 against the other. So I've kind of found it to be, I haven't found like really accounting for that defense to matter yet. I may tell you a completely different story next September. When I've had a chance in the offseason to go look at it again. But so far I haven't really found that matters too much.
And now, plus the teams, I'm sorry, I'm trampling all over you, Jack.
That's okay. That's okay. Go ahead. You ask your question.
I was just gonna point out. Plus, if you're 1-4 against, if you're essentially 5-5 each way, but they're being undervalued, your break-even percentage is a lot better than 50% anyway.
Yeah, exactly. And and for a while there was like NFL quarterback. I mean, if you take like the NFL averages, right, you should get that you're slightly more likely to throw a pick than not. So you should be like minus 120 to throw a pick on average. And oftentimes you were getting NFL quarterbacks at like plus 130 to throw a pick.
Yeah.
To throw a pick. That's mostly gone. So like kind of the volume of bets is kind of gone down. But that's roughly how it's gone.
Well, that was actually going to be my next question is, have you seen the market start to get more efficient on these props?
For sure. I believe like 5 weeks ago, I had like 8 bets and it's been consistently 3 over the last couple of weeks. And, I'm pretty, so, I mean, you guys know props are a little bit easier to beat than, a market like NFL sides. And I can still take a pretty big difference between what my model says and the break even probability. I use a threshold of like 5%. And while that was giving me basically twice the number of bets about a month ago. And now it's consistently like 3 or 4. So yes, I have seen the market shift. I was talking to Gil about this on a numbers game over at VSiN, and he was quoting me some data about how like if you just blind bet the overs on interceptions, you were doing really well in the beginning of the season. So I think the books did catch up on that a little bit, and so there's fewer bets, and that means I need to run some numbers on some other NFL prop.
Yeah, I was certainly enjoying Jimmy G interceptions early in the season, but that was a gold mine. But what are some of the other prop areas that you've been looking to hit now that interceptions is kind of getting more efficient?
We'll see. I haven't quantitatively kind of attacked anything else with the NFL. I kind of have the start of some code to look at sacks. So like defensive player sacks. And then I kind of wrote that code and it was like, there's not a ton of books that actually have this. Like DK will definitely put it out there, but it's not like everywhere. I've been dabbling a little bit in college football, but I don't really have a model for that. And that's been kind of interesting as well, because I think you can beat college football props, but for me, it requires a lot of work, right? Because you got to go in and you don't have I don't have a number that my model says, right? So I'm kind of going in there and in general, like looking at the unabated prop screen and saying, oh, well, who's slated for 100 yards? I want to bet the under on that. But then you got to go in and do the research and how many carries is this guy going to get? Whereas with the NFL interception stuff, I have a model. I know what the number is. Sometimes I throw it out because I'm like, okay, well, he's doing really well this season compared to, like his 3-year average, which is what I use. And so I'll certainly do some handicapping there, but it's quick. And then with the college football stuff, it's not quick. It takes work. So hopefully next year I can be more quantitative with it.
Yeah, just to tip our hand a little, is one of our future guests coming up on the podcast in a week or two is Galin, who is our college football prop guru. And I've seen the way he works, and we're going to talk to him a little bit about the way he works. And it's a lot of digging deep to find out usage stats and depth charts and who's bumped up in the depth chart and who's bumped down. And yeah, it's a very involved process. And then you got to multiply that by the hundreds of college football teams, and it becomes a very daunting task. I would never want to try to tackle it. Ed, I want to get back to the interception thing, which is I had one lingering question about it. So you're relying on the batted ball stat mainly. Have you noticed any evolution of quarterback play? So in other words, does a quarterback from season to season have different batted ball stats, or is this a stat that seems to be constant across multiple years?
It is very constant across multiple
Really?
years. So I actually found it to have the same predictability as something like completion percentage, which I was kind of shocked at. It's very steady from year to year. I used that this preseason. I had so Jalen Hurts and Daniel Jones both had kind of unsustainably low interception rates last year. I think they were both at about 1%. The NFL average is about 2.3%. Went over on their season interception props. I think Hurts is already over. I got to check that. He's either over or like about to go over 8.5. Daniel Jones was also at 8.5. It's not going over because he got hurt, which is always the danger with going over on a season long prop. But I do find it is very steady. And it's about, I mean, obviously there's still a lot of randomness, but it's about as consistent of a statistics as you'll find for quarterbacks.
Is interesting. That's when I used to do a lot of prop work. That was the key, is finding a prop where you have a historical basis that also has the tendency to continue rather than to tail off over time. With a lot of the baseball props, there's a degradation of skill that happens as a baseball career goes on. And so you kind of have to curve them all downward as you continue. Nate Silver noticed that really early on, and he developed the Pacoda projections when he was with Baseball Prospectus. So it's kind of a known thing, but that's very interesting to hear that this has been so constant in the past. I'm kind of intrigued now.
I'll give you access to my site. You can look at all the data if you'd like. I had it public for a while, but had to make the decision to put it beyond the paywall. So
keeping in line there with that question, though, taking it one step further, if batted ball rates and interception rates are generally constant for quarterbacks, is that implying that decision making doesn't get better over time for quarterbacks?
Not necessarily. I think you need to be careful. The overall analysis, like if you look at all quarterbacks that in consecutive seasons have thrown at least 100 pass attempts, how sticky is what I call bad ball rate? So, the rate at which you put the ball in dangerous positions, it's very sticky. That certainly doesn't mean that a quarterback can't get better or worse at that. I'm trying to think of a good example for this year. Yeah, one's not really coming on.
I think one for the inverse in Josh Allen.
Yeah. Well, Josh Allen's been super interesting. Like actually his bad ball rate in general has been good. And then he goes out opening night and throw 3 picks, and none of them, they were all of like the gunslinger mentality type, right? And you're like, what is going on? What's going on with his new OC, who is no longer his OC? So, and then he went through a long stretch with that. He was really good when you look at putting the ball in dangerous positions, and then sometimes it goes back. So, I did like an Allen under against Cincinnati, and that didn't hit. But it looked bad because he kind of threw one right to the defense. It was just kind of a mistake. He only actually had two passes. He actually only had 2 bad balls in that game, which is usually good and more likely than not to not throw a pick there. So, but certainly an interesting quarterback to look at.
So, Ed, do you feel that you're going to keep moving towards this prop space? Look, right. I am one of the first people that has ever said, I wasn't the first, but I've always said that, props aren't sustainable. You can't just be a prop specialist. But in the new age of U.S. sports books, regulated sports books, props are a viable option. And there are books that will take prop action. Not all of them will, but there are some that will. And you can now make a good living being a prop specialist. Is that where you're headed, Ed?
I do. I do think that's where I am headed. My customers are not pro bettors. My customers are kind of more recreational people that want an edge, that are interested in the analytics. And a lot of them live in my neighborhood here. And it's been interesting to see how they interact with betting since it became legal in Michigan. And the key thing there is that they don't care whether they have action on a side, a total, or a prop. It really doesn't matter to them. They want some action on the game. They want to be more likely to win than not. And if that's really the case, like, the answer is pretty simple about what you should focus on, right? The place that you're going to get the most wins. Yeah. I'm certainly going to keep running my numbers for spreads and totals, and I'm certainly going to keep betting those. But I think props is a pretty good avenue. One of the reasons I ended up getting into this was kind of over the last season after football ended. I run my newsletter, and I had 5 Nugget Saturday every Saturday, and I try to do that throughout the off season. And when you start getting into the NBA finals and there's no football, actually, once the NFL draft, so the NFL draft obviously gives you a lot of opportunity to put out some fun bets there. Once that ends, I was like, oh, what am I going to do now? I mean, my promise to readers is that you're going to have some action on the weekend. And so that's when I started thinking about NBA props, did some during the finals. And then I started thinking about baseball after that. And that's kind of what led me more into, well, it's football season. Let's look at this work I did with interceptions. So I think, I am headed more in that direction. I think there's some interesting opportunities in basketball as well. And I talked about a little bit about baseball. I do think there's opportunities, and I'm hopefully going to be looking at those.
Ed, thank you so much for being with us here today. It's been a fantastic conversation. I hope that people have learned a lot, because I certainly have. Where can people find you and the fantastic work you're doing?
Yeah, thanks so much, Tom. You can find me at thepowerrank.com. There are paid services, but what I would recommend is checking out the free stuff first. Sign up for my free newsletter at thepowerrank.com. Every Saturday, I come out with 5 Nugget Saturday, and kind of, my mission for you is that if you read that, you'll have something to bet that weekend. And hopefully it's also not always my stuff. Usually my stuff is like a prop, but I try to curate some of the best stuff from around the sports betting world. I've had a lot of your guys' content in there, often talk about what the unabated line says, just as an example. So yeah, you can check that out at thepowerrank.com.
Ed, thank you again so much for your time. Again, people really should head on over to thepowerrank.com. I absolutely love all of the fantastic details and tidbits that you have there to help people get an edge when it comes to betting. And of course, if you want to get an edge betting with Unabated, you can head to unabated.com. Use the promo code ThePowerRank, all one word. We'll throw it in the description below as well. And you can get yourself a 5-day free trial of Unabated so that you can get in on the action, spot some edges yourself using our fantastic tools, and you can even schedule a one-on-one demo using the link in the description of this video. Either myself or one of our fantastic customer service reps will walk you through all of our awesome tools. As always, thank you guys so much for listening here today. You know the drill. If you like us, drop us that 5-star rating, leave us a review. Grow the podcast. Help us by telling your friends about the show and that they need to tune in. If you don't like us, tell your enemies, make them listen to us instead. But for now, that is going to do it for us this week. We'll be back next week. As always, best of luck, and let's cash some tickets.